Good morning and welcome to this edition of Authors at Google. I'm Dan Russell. I'm from the Search Quality Group, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce my friend Chip Conley today, who's going to be talking about something I think we all actually need to know a little bit more about. Now, I could tell you a lot about Chip, but I won't, because you're at Google, and so you can presumably find things like he's a rebel entrepreneur, he's done fantastic work rehabbing and starting up hotels all around the place. He's won fantastic awards. He's a really interesting guy, but you can look that up. What I want to do is tell you a little bit about the topic of today's talk. He's a practiced author, having written multiple books, and you might recognize some of his slacker co-authors. So he's done this before, and we started talking a while ago about what would it mean to write a book about equations about emotions. And we talked about that for a while. When he first said that, I thought of an equation like this. This is Schrodinger's wave equation, and I thought, it's going to describe the waves of emotion. It's going to be a quantum mechanical view of the way people act and behave. He said, no. That's not the right approach. So he said, what about a beautiful equation? We want simple, elegant simplicity. And I thought of this equation, which many of you will recognize, which is all those things, but it's not for people. That's really for mathematicians, right? We have a distinct subspecies here. We're encompassing. We take all kinds of people here. And so I started thinking, well, maybe we can describe emotions as systems of equations like this. No, Dan. And so the more we talked, the more I started to realize that what Chip was about is trying to describe these sort of neat conceptual nuggets of information that describe terms about emotions a little bit like Ohm's law. The simplest physical law is described as an equation which gets represented often as this sort of triangular model that allows you to very quickly see the relationship between different terms. When Chip and I were talking about emotional equations, I realized that's what he means by equation. It's a model of the relationship between these conceptual categories. By this book, he's expressing this, I think, very elegant and beautiful notion that we can have this embedded in our belief system and understand ourselves far better than you would normally have without this. So Chip is my Burning Man buddy. He's a Maslow-topian. He's an author. He's my friend. I'm very proud to introduce Chip Conley.
It is very strange to come to Google and lecture you on math. But let me say thank you, Dan. I loved the pyramid. I loved the Ohm's law in the form of the pyramid because for those of you who know a little bit about my last book, I am a Maslow-topian. I'm a big believer in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that led to me writing the book Peak, How Great Companies Get Their Mojo from Maslow. So I'm going to start today with a little video, and it's a little maybe a little hard to actually see, but it's going to give you a frame of reference for my key theme of the day. And so let's see if we can make this work and if it actually is visible up there. Here we go.
Hello there. Checking any bags?
Yeah, just two.
Okay. The second bag will be $100.
Okay, just one bag then.
Here's your boarding pass, sir. Gate 83. Enjoy your flight.
Bound to fall.
I wish the sound and the visuals were a little bit better, but I did bring a friend here who's the star of our show. Some of you don't know you have emotional baggage. And most of you don't know that within your emotional baggage, you have emotional baggage. There's, in fact, bags within the bags. What I'm going to talk about today is the idea that math can be used in the form of relationships, understanding the relationships of your emotions. Now that may be a blasphemous idea to those of you who are the PhDs in math in the room. And when I first brought it up to Dan did scratch his head a little bit and sort of was trying to understand what I meant. And I'm going to tell you my story today because it's a story of it's a personal story of how I needed a lighthouse. When I was in a very difficult place, I was the CEO of a company and felt like I was supposed to have my life together, but my life was falling apart. And somehow understanding the idea of an emotion as an equation became a bit of a mantra for me. The word mantra, Meng could teach you this because he's good at this stuff. Mantra technically means mind instrument. And so what I needed was something to be the mind instrument for me when I was going through a lot of difficult emotions. So I've been a hotelier for 25 years. 24 years of them, I was the CEO of company Joie de Vivre. Many of you have probably stayed at the Hotel Levante, one of our hotels in Mountain View. We're the second largest boutique hotelier in the world now. Joie de Vivre is we're based in San Francisco. People show up at our hotel front desks with their baggage. Some of it's not physical. Some of it's the emotional baggage type. And what I'm hoping today is in the course of the time together that I'm going to help you understand what's some of the baggage that you may have going on in your own life and how you make sense of the relationship of the ingredients, in essence, that create anxiety or happiness or despair. But first, let me give you a little background. So as I mentioned before, and as Dan mentioned, I'm a big fan of Abe Maslow. I took a grand total of one psychology class at Stanford. I went to Stanford undergrad. I went to Stanford Business School. I took a class with Phil Zimbardo, and Phil Zimbardo. So he was my psychology professor. And the one thing I remember from Psychology 1 in college was Abe Maslow, because he was the guy who talked about best practices in human behavior as opposed to worst practices. He's also the one who came up with the great quote, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. And he said that to the psychology profession and said, why is it that we think that all people are broken? Why don't we study the flourishing people? And by studying the people who are flourishing or self-actualized in life, maybe we can learn something that we can apply to everybody else. And that's why he created the hierarchy of needs. And 10 years ago, in the wake of the dot-com bust and 9/11 and you name it, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. And here in the Bay Area, for those of you who are living here in the Bay Area 10 years ago, we went through a bit of a minor depression, economic depression, based upon what happened in the dot-com bust. Well, at that point, we were the largest hotelier in the Bay Area. We had no hotels outside the Bay Area, so we were in a lot of trouble. We applied Maslow's hierarchy of needs to our company, and we tried to create a self-actualized company, and it worked. We tripled in size. We had no layoffs. We got the award for the highest customer satisfaction award in the hospitality industry. And after Google, we came in second place for the best place to work in the San Francisco Bay Area, so thank you, Google. But that was the last downturn. And this is the tale of two downturns, two Jewish shrinks, and two goys named Chip. And the last downturn, I felt a bit like a gladiator, and my company, Joie de Vivre, lived up to its name, Joy of Life, and we used Maslow to get ourselves through it. This downturn, wasn't feeling so much that way. I actually was feeling quite the opposite. I felt more like a prisoner than a gladiator. And so I started reading this book, a book by Viktor Frankl called Man's Search for Meaning. How many of you are familiar with the book? So a handful of folks. So Man's Search for Meaning was written by Viktor Frankl in the 1940s. He was a Jewish psychologist in Vienna in the 1930s. And his basic premise as a psychologist was that the fuel of life is meaning. That's what creates the sense of why we show up and show up for our lives each day. And then ironically, and sort of as if God has a weird sense of humor, he was put in a concentration camp to see if his theory of fuel of meaning being the fuel of life actually made sense. He ended up writing about it, and I started reading this book in early 2008. Peak, my book, came out in September of 2007, and I was going around the country and giving about 80 speeches a year on self-actualization in the context of work, and including here at Google. But in early 2008, I was very clear that my life wasn't I was like the guy going out and talking about self-actualization, but not feeling it, which was a really awkward, it's like the preacher going out and giving his sermon and then going out and doing something that we won't talk about here, but you know what those preachers do. And I ended up starting to read this book because I felt like I was a bit of a prisoner to my identity and to what was the upcoming downturn that I could sort of see. Because the hotel industry basically can see downturns. You see downturns faster than we do because of the analytics associated with what goes on with Google. We see it pretty quickly though too, because one of the first things people cut back on in terms of spending is travel. But there was a quote in Man's Search for Meaning that really spoke to me on a deep level. And it was this one: between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. So for me, who's the whining CEO, Chip Conley, up there like being upset about his life? Well, I wasn't whining about it. In fact, I had this growing divide between my public image and my private reality. And when that happens, that's actually quite often when depression and a few other things can kick in. Well, I had other friends in my life who had a growing divide between their public image and their private reality too. Over the course of 2008 through 2010, I had 5 friends commit suicide, take their lives. And one of them, who my friend Greg Jones, who's here today, knows well, was my friend Chip, and Greg's friend Chip. This is not me. This is a guy named Chip Hankins. And you know, my talks in my book are really dedicated to him. He was very close friend with both Greg and me. And he was one of those guys who sort of, you know, people in your life are sort of they're the light of the party, they're the light of your life, and they're deep thinkers. Chip was all of those things. In some ways, he was a mirror for how I aspired to be in my own life. And we shared the same name. We both actually owned bars, and you know, we went for long periods of time we didn't drink. I mean, there's a lot of similarities between us. On April 30th, 2008, I got a call from his boss, the president of his insurance company, because for 12 years, Chip was our insurance broker for Joie de Vivre. And I got a call and found out that Chip had actually taken his life. And so, you know, going to the funeral, the memorial service for, at Greg's ranch, actually, and hearing about a friend and talking about your friend who'd taken their life. It's hard. It's very hard. And when they have the same name you have, it's a little bit harder. And when you're sort of in the throes of your own depression, the early stages for me, it made it a lot. It made it a lot to handle. So I felt after that experience, I really needed to make sense of this man's search for meaning a little bit more. But then I had my own experience. I had 2.5 months after the memorial service for Chip, I was in St. Louis again, which is where I was when I got the news about Chip. I was giving a speech about self-actualization, and at the end of my speech, I went flatline. I was on stage giving a speech. Fortunately, I sat down because I had a broken ankle at the time. Sat down, and the second person I was signing a book for, the person said to me, "You look awfully white," and I just went unconscious. And within about 5 minutes, the paramedics were there, and they put heart monitors on me, and that's when I went flatline. So between that and a bunch of other things happening in my life, a long-term relationship ending, my son going to San Quentin wrongfully, he ended up getting out after being 8 months in San Quentin. A federal judge let him out. But, you know, having your son go to San Quentin for 8 months is not a fun thing. And then we were running out of money as a company, and I was running out of money personally. So I took Man's Search for Meaning, and I said, you know what? I want to understand why I want to continue to stand and be on this earth, and I don't want to go the path that that others, Chip and others, felt like they had to take. So I turned this famous book on meaning into an equation. And I am not a math major. I am so far from a math major. But what I needed was something to help to explain the relationship between the components that were creating some depression and despair in my life. So this was the equation. Despair equals suffering minus meaning. It's a little bit like sacred algebra. Suffering was the constant. If you're going through a really rough time in your life, suffering is a constant. If you're a Buddhist, it's the first noble truth of Buddhism, that suffering, dukkha, is ever present. Having Meng in the front row is really hard. It's very distracting right now. I should, between Meng and between the PhD math people in the room, it's like, okay, I am really setting myself up for failure today. No, but suffering is ever present when you're going through a really rough time. And the funny thing about it, the sad thing about it, is we tend to actually focus on it. And when you're focusing on it, you're not making it any better. What this helped me to see is that suffering is the constant and meaning is the variable. And if you put your attention on the meaning and increase the meaning, the despair goes down. And that was my own little mantra that I was using in the summer of 2008 after my flatline experience when I was going through a bunch of other crap. And it was working for me, because what it helped me to get back to is like, what's the lesson? With all the stuff that's going on, what's the lesson? I also found a study, a really interesting study of women who grew up during the Civil War. During the Depression. Women who grew up in the 1930s. And what it showed was that women who actually grew up in the 1930s in their formative years, later in life, when they became a widow, because quite often they outlived their husband, they actually had built during the 1930s in their teens and their 20s resilience, independence, courage. They were better able to handle being a widow than the women who didn't grow up during the Depression. Major study by Elker and Leiter that was done like 10, 20 years ago. So I said, okay, maybe I'm actually in emotional boot camp right now. And maybe during emotional boot camp, I'm actually building some emotional muscles that I have, but I hadn't been working out in a while. And so that's what I started to think about. And then in November of 2008, when the world was starting to fall apart in a faster pace, it was 2 months after Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, and in the hotel business, people in our company could say, my God, we're about to go into our second once-in-a-lifetime downturn in the same decade. I was supposed to give a speech to the top 80 executives in my company at the Dream Inn in Santa Cruz, which is, if you haven't been there lately, it's a hotel we renovated a couple years ago. It's sort of cool. And we were all sitting looking at the view, and everybody was looking for the cheerleading speech from Chip, the CEO. And instead of giving the cheerleading speech, I threw it away. Because what I saw in the room was 80 people who were full of suffering. And so I just said, on an easel, I just wrote up my equation, and I said I want to just share for the next hour my equation with you. Because I actually think the worst thing I could do right now is to be up here cheerleading. And I instead think we need to do what Abe Maslow talked about, is we need to have a good exercise in psychohygiene. Psychohygiene basically means, in the Abe Maslow term, it means that when you're going through a really difficult time, you learn how to shower together. Because frankly, what happens in an organization during difficult times is there's a lot of stress, becomes a bit of a sweat box, and actually people sort of go at each other instead of actually sort of figuring out how to actually make people feel a little bit better. So I felt like what we needed to do is actually be authentic and vulnerable and allow people to talk about their fears about being a general manager of a hotel that has just 2 years ago got through the last downturn, and now we're going into another one. So an hour later, after the talk and people conversing and people telling their stories, someone came up to me and gave me a whisper and said, "Do you have an equation for jealousy?" And someone else came up and said, "Do you have one for anxiety?" And then someone, the smartest one in the room, came up and said, "Do you have one for happiness?" So I said, this is interesting. I created this equation for myself, and then I shared it with my senior executives, and it seemed to actually resonate. So I said, I want to learn more about emotions. This is Isaac Newton really smart dude. I mean, come on. Now, you know that he actually helped to, invent calculus, or learn, I don't know if you can invent calculus, but he was able to sort of help us understand calculus, gravity. He didn't invent it, but he helped us to explain it. The telescope. But you probably didn't know that Isaac Newton also created the color wheel and helped us to understand that if you combine red plus blue, you get purple. So I didn't know that Isaac Newton did that. Well, as I started to look at the color wheel, I started to see, well, this idea of despair equals suffering minus meaning is sort of like, it's like an emotion wheel. And I did my deep dive. I did sort of my PhD in psychology. And I spent the next year and a half to 2 years learning and reading about 150 books and 300 studies in psychology. And I learned about this guy, Dr. Robert Plutchik, who had created in the 1980s something called the emotion wheel. You can't really see it very well up here, but if you add joy plus anticipation, it equals optimism. And he created this emotion wheel. And the reason it never got a lot of play within the psychology academic community is because back in the 1980s, if you were doing backwater academic studies in psychology, you were focusing on emotions, because emotions was not a very well-respected piece of the psychology world. Today it is, but back then it wasn't. So it never really got very far. But I said to myself, wow, I guess there's some history of the psychology academic world looking at the idea of equations for emotions. In fact, I started to learn a little bit more about the happiness equation that Marty Seligman, famous positive psychologist, had created, where he said happiness is 50% your biological set point, 10% your circumstances, and 40% your intention. So I decided to do a little bit more research, and I decided to go out and study happiness. Now, I could have gone to Disneyland, the happiest place on earth, which is where I grew up. I grew up like within 5 minutes of Disneyland. Instead, I went to Bhutan. Why? Anybody know why Bhutan and happiness? I mean, yes. Yeah, the Gross National Happiness Index. So 40 years ago, the 17-year-old king of Bhutan was in India. And someone said to him, what's the GDP, or actually they said GNP, because GDP hadn't been created yet. What's the GNP for Bhutan? And the 17-year-old king looked at the Indian journalist and said, why do we care about GNP? Why don't we care about gross national happiness? Now, at the time, it didn't take a lot of note. People didn't take much note of it. But 40 years later, there are now 50 countries in the world that are studying their gross national happiness in some form with some name. Bhutan was the first one, and because it's sort of a really cool place, that's Bhutan, that's Tiger's Nest in Bhutan, I said, I'm going to go to Bhutan, and I'm going to spend a week studying the Gross National Happiness Index there, get to know the Prime Minister, get to know the people in the UN who are there in Bhutan studying happiness, and I'll come back and then I'll go talk to a bunch of other people on the happiness circuit. So I did, and I came back with this equation. And I was fortunate enough that a guy named Chris Anderson, not Chris Anderson, the Wired Chris Anderson, but Chris Anderson, the TED Chris Anderson, found out about my equation and then asked me to give a finale TED Talk 2 years ago at the TED conference and introduce my happiness equation. So this is a little bit of a mind tease. Happiness equals wanting what you have divided by having what you want. It comes back to a guy named Rabbi Hyman Schachtel in 1954 said, happiness is not about having what you want. It's about wanting what you have. And it's learning to actually get to the practicing of gratitude. Fastest way, the psychology profession and those who actually study happiness, basically they all say the fastest way to create happiness in the moment when you're not feeling happy is to figure out how to get to gratitude as quickly as possible. And it's not just the process of actually getting to gratitude, it's also the practice of expressing the gratitude. Because actually just experiencing the gratitude without expressing it is like wrapping a Christmas present and not giving it. So the idea of practicing gratitude is what wanting what you have means. So when you want what you have a tendency to practice gratitude, to feel and appreciate what you have. We in the United States get very wrapped up in the denominator of this equation, the pursuit of gratification, having what we want, the act of going out and having what we want. Let me tell you, I am a type A person. I was a CEO for 24 years. I went to Stanford. I went to Stanford Business School. I am a pursuer by nature. So I'm not here to say that we should not pursue happiness. It's actually in the Declaration of Independence of our country. But if you look at the dictionary definition of pursuit, in some dictionaries, the definition of pursuit is to chase with hostility. Do we chase happiness with hostility in the United States? I think on occasion we do. So in some ways, happiness is about how do you practice gratitude, and how do you be careful about the pursuing of gratification. For me, it's not about actually being a couch potato and just writing in my gratitude journal every day. I wouldn't be able to do that very well. But it is when I'm in that state of not feeling very happy about something, I can ask myself this equation and the question, how do I get to gratitude right now? How do I practice some gratitude? And am I spending too much time in the denominator in pursuing gratification? This book, Emotional Equations, which Books Inc. is here, so they've got discount books. It's lovely that you Google, I think, subsidizes them, right? Well, this book actually, the first week it was out, it went on to the New York Times bestseller list at number 7. Of course, my immediate reaction was, I want number 4 next week, because I was pursuing gratification. And I saw it immediately. And when I could actually laugh at myself and say, damn, I wrote a book about emotional equations and it actually did really well. And my first reaction when it did really well was, I want to be number 4. So that's how our mind works. And it's been working that way for a long time. We know who this guy is. What you didn't know about Socrates is he was the first guy to ever go on a treadmill. And he was the first guy to buy Nikes. But Socrates once said, he who is not contented with what he has would not be contented with what he would like to have. So on a treadmill, because most of you have probably heard of the hedonic treadmill. And it's a treadmill that we all jump on. And it's the treadmill of gratification. How do we go out and pursue our gratification? How do we go out and get what we want? How do we go out, and if we've gotten this, how do we go out and get that? And generally speaking, for those of us who are leaders, we want people working for us who have that mentality. So I'm not saying we shouldn't actually have the pursuit. What I am saying is when you're not feeling happy, just know that this is what's going on. And it's been going on for centuries, with going back to Socrates' time. So after getting despair and happiness, I've gotten the 2 equations at the extremes. I started asking myself, what's the number one emotion that seems to be pervading organizational culture in the United States in this recession? This was 2009 at this point. And this was it. It was anxiety. It's the number one emotion in most organizations in the world, especially in a recession. There are 2 ingredients that represent, according to anxiety researchers, 95 to 96% of the anxiety that we tend to feel. It's what you don't know and what you can't control. Those are the 2 variables. And so it's anxiety equals uncertainty times powerlessness. And it's not a plus, it's a times, because they have a combustible effect. And the truth is when you can take one of them down closer to 0, it actually does help with the other. And it helps to reduce the anxiety. So I decided to create a balance sheet. Okay, another thing I don't know much about, accounting. I did go to Stanford Business School, but I hated accounting. Didn't like math, and I took 1 psychology class. What the hell am I doing up here? But you'll see this anxiety balance sheet. If you are struggling with something in your life, in something that's making you a little anxious, try this exercise. Create 4 columns. The first column is what do I know? Second column is what don't I know about this thing that's making me anxious. The third column is what can I influence? And the fourth column is what can't I influence? Okay, let's see it all together. So the anxiety balance sheet says there are 4 columns. Columns 1 and columns 3 here are the good columns, what I do know and what I can influence. Column 2 and 4 are the bad columns. They're the ones that actually create the anxiety. They create the uncertainty and powerlessness. I've done this balance sheet with people, leaders in companies from CBS to Nordstrom's to Charles Schwab. And what I've found is really interesting is when people do this exercise, 75 to 80% of people have more items in columns 1 and column 3, the good columns, the assets, than they do in columns 2 and 4. But when you're anxious, you tend to obsess about what's in column 2 and column 4. Then, just actually getting it on paper helps to take some of the anxiety away. Secondly, you can look at column 2 and say, what don't I know? And you could ask yourself, how could I go learn that? Maybe I'll go to Google, and maybe I can learn something on Google. Yes, that's one way. Maybe you could ask your husband or your wife if they're actually having an affair. That's a novel idea. Or maybe you could ask your boss, are there going to be layoffs, and am I going to lose my job? Now, most of us think that actually asking someone the answer to what do I not know, trying to take something from column 2 and to put it in column 1 is a really stupid idea. Because why do I want to know the answer? Well, there's a study done, you probably heard it before because it's sort of like one of those sort of American or urban myth kind of studies where people had the choice of getting an electric shock. There are only 2 choices. You can either get the electric shock now, and it's twice as painful as an electric shock you can get in the next 24 hours. So you get either an electric shock now, and you just know you got it over with, or you can get an electric shock in the next 24 hours randomly when you're not expecting it. So what did most people select? What would you select? Now or sometime in the next 24 hours but half as painful? Okay, how many want now? How many want sometime in the next 24 hours randomly? You're perfect. 2/3 of you said that you wanted it now. And that's exactly what the survey results showed, is 2/3 of people want to get it over now. Why? Because mental stress is actually more painful than physical stress, the physical pain. So what does that mean for us as leaders here? That means that if you have bad news to give, and you have a sense that the people who work with you are starting to get an inkling about the bad news, give the bad news. Get it out there. The anxiety shuts down the parts of your brain that tend to be more creative and innovative. You tend to spend your time in the amygdala, at the base of the brain, that caveman part of your brain, and not in the prefrontal cortex where a lot of the reasoning and creativity and innovation come from. All right, curiosity. The founder of Sony once said, curiosity is the fuel of creativity. I agree. Curiosity, Marty Seligman has also shown that curiosity is what actually helps create resilience. When people are resilient, it has a lot to do with coming up with new ways to look at something. So I started saying, well, curiosity seems like an interesting and a very appropriate emotion or state of being to talk about here at Google. This is a very curious place. What I started to realize when I did my research on curiosity is that people who tend to be curious, strangely enough, and for those of you in the room, you're going to sort of not believe this, but it's actually a study. It was in The Economist. It was in The Economist. It must be true. So I'm 51 years old. Dan came to my 50th birthday party at Burning Man. And so I was 50 years old, I just turned 50 in December of 2010, and I see the cover of The Economist magazine in December of 2010, The Joy of Growing Old. I figure okay, well, this is written for me. I better learn about it. And there was this interesting graph in there called the U-bend of life, and it was self-reported well-being in the United States. And what it shows basically is the following. What most importantly is what I'm going to tell you about the curiosity that relates to it, is that people tend to be happiest as adults when they're in their college years, 18 to 20, although it sort of goes down each year. And then strangely enough, between about 25, 22, 24, and 34, 35, that's a 10-year period where people's happiness is relatively stable. And then the shit hits the fan at age 35. And between 35 and 50, how many of you are 35 to 50 here? Okay, I'm sorry. It just gets worse every year. Now, there's a bunch of reasons for this. Kids have something to do with it, interestingly enough. Disappointment has something to do with it. It's the number one emotion that gets worse each year between 35 and 50. And then the other thing that's related to this that actually sort of is relevant to what happens at age 50 and beyond is starting at age 50 and beyond is each decade the happiness goes up, which is odd because I think generally we have historically thought that people in their 70s and 80s are not very happy. And what's newer evidence is showing is that actually people get happier again. Why? Well, the number one reason, the number one parallel for people who are in their 18 to the 20-year range and people who are in their 70s and 80s is that they were curious. Now, I don't think of my parents as all that curious in their mid-70s, but the fact is when there was a difference between having a sense of wonder and having a sense of awe. People late in life, strangely enough, have a sense of awe about life more and more. There's a weird sense that they are just a small speck in a bigger, magnificent picture, and there's something beautiful about that and something curious about it. And there's people like Peter Drucker. You may have heard of Peter Drucker, famous management theorist. Up till his dying day at age 95, every 2 years he would go out and study something that had nothing to do with his career. It could be Japanese ikebana, it could be, American Civil War history, because what he believed is that when you're curious in life, it fuels you. It fuels you and gives you that sense of both the wonder and the awe. So interestingly enough, I would say find those places in your own life where you tend to be most curious. Google may be one of them. Burning Man is one of them for me. TED has been one of them for me. The Sundance Film Festival is one of them for me. What helps take the blinders off? Because what tends to happen in midlife for a lot of people, probably less so on this campus, is that people put the blinders on, and that's when actually the curiosity starts to go away and some of the happiness starts to diminish. I was really lucky. How many of you have heard of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi? Yeah, well, a few of you. So, and I'm going to call him Mike because that's what he likes to be called, Mike Csikszentmihalyi. He wrote a book called Flow. And when you hear people talk about being in the flow or in the zone, quite often they're sort of speaking Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's language, Mike Csikszentmihalyi's language. The idea was that there's certain times in your life when you actually get in the flow where you just sort of feel like it's all coming together, and somehow, for 15-year-olds, it tend to be when they're playing video games. And interestingly enough, if you look at the components that create a sense of flow in people's lives, very much so. You'll see it in a second. Well, Dan actually helped me with this equation because we were talking about flow, and it's a combination of skill and challenge. Well, Mike Csikszentmihalyi mentored me. He invited me to come up to his ranch with his wife, Isabella, in Montana for 3 days and to just talk about flow, which was like the coolest thing in the world. And I was just there to learn. I was curious. I was very curious. And he showed me some of his diagrams, and this is actually, I think, particularly appropriate for people in the engineering world and people who are dealing with the riddles of life. On one axis, there's challenge. On the other axis, there's skill. If you have a lot of skill and very little challenge, you tend to be in the boredom place. A lot of challenge, very little skill, you're in the anxiety place. This is what it looks like if you look at the whole graph and the different emotions you have. And ideally, what we want to do in life is we want to get into that flow zone. And the flow zone is basically flow equals 1.0. Skill divided by challenge. There's sort of a 45-degree vector that actually sort of helps you understand that's where it's ideal. Actually, a little bit off, for those of you more precise in the audience, it's less than 1.0, because what Mike Csikszentmihalyi has shown is that you actually want a little more challenge than skill, because what actually sort of ratchets you up to that 45-degree angle as far to the right as possible is something that sort of says your challenge is a little bit higher than your skill, and you're just sort of going like this, and like that. So qualities that do that for people, it's when you have clear goals that define success. And as we look at the 6 that I'm going to show here, just think about 15-year-olds with their video games. Immediate feedback so that you can incrementally adjust. The constant balance between your skill level and your challenge. The ability to focus exclusively on the activity through completion. A loss of sense of time and self-consciousness when you're in the midst of the work. And the activity being intrinsically rewarding so that there is an effortlessness of action. So that's flow in the form of an equation. And the last one I'm going to introduce before I just sort of then sum up and we have questions, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why is this relevant to leadership, is thriving. Now, as I started to do my research on the idea of emotions in the form of equations, I did find not just that Marty Seligman happiness equation, but I found a few other equations as well. I found an equation by a woman named Barbara Fredrickson, famous psychologist who's written a book called Positivity. She has a website called positivityratio.com. And she'd shown that in the context of people's own personal lives, as well as in an organizational context, if you want to get into that sort of thriving cycle, we're very familiar in our lives of being in that downward spiral. The downward spiral is when when everything just sort of like domino theory, everything gets worse. Well, there are upward spirals too. The New York Giants seem to be in an upward spiral. The book Moneyball talked about the Oakland A's winning 20 games in a row, 10 years ago or so. So we sort of can get into upward spirals in our lives, and organizations can too. In rowing, there's a phenomenon in rowing when a crew is all rowing at the same time in unison, and it's just magical. The boat almost lifts out of the water. It doesn't almost. It actually starts to lift out of the water. They call that swing in rowing circles. So it's an amazing physical experience. Is that actually the unison and of people being together at the same time creates almost a thriving phenomena that the boat comes out of the water, and therefore there's less friction and the boat goes even faster. Great organizations do that well. And the reason why Barbara Fredrickson said the ratio needs to be 3-to-1, 3-to-1 positive to negative, is because Daniel Kahneman, who has a great new book out, Thinking Fast and Slow, he's shown with Amos Tversky a few years ago that, frankly, we have this loss aversion thing. We have a tendency to, when we have a bad experience in our life, and then we have a comparable good experience in our life, the bad experience has twice of an emotional impact on us as the good experience. It's like our brains are sort of, Velcro for negativity and Teflon for positivity. So that's part of the reason why the ratio needs to be 3-to-1. And in organizational context, that's what they've been able to show. Now, for me, I used this in my own company when I really understood this. We had our top 15 executives. We would do an executive committee meeting every week. And during a recession, those executive committee meetings were terrible. I mean, you know what I'm talking about. I mean, things are better now, but about 2 or 3 years ago at Google, it wasn't a whole lot of fun seeing some of the financials and some of the results, and there's a lot more pressure. And so these meetings we would have was 90% negative stuff, 90% all the bad stuff, and about 10% the positive. So I said, well, I want to actually leave this meeting, this 2-hour meeting every week, on a positive note. Not just to fake it, but I want to remind people that there's some good things happening here. So what we did at the executive committee meeting is I said, starting next week, I want you to bring in an example of something that happened in the last week out there in the field. One of our hotels, we have almost 40 hotels. Come in and talk about something that happened that was great and somebody who deserves some extra recognition. And so starting the next week we did this, and only 2 people raised their hand out of the 15. But each week we do it. And it could be the bellman of the Hotel Rex, one of our hotels in Union Square area of San Francisco. And it could be that the hotel has only 1 elevator and it went down for 2 days. And if you have a 7-story building that has only 1 elevator and it's down for 2 days, you need a lot more bellmen because you need people to schlep the bags up and down the stairs. So there's a guy who had his family in town from New York, and instead of actually spending time with his family, one of the bellmen worked 16 hours a day, 2 days in a row, because we needed extra bellman service. Now, he got paid overtime, and he might have gotten thanked by his supervisor, but did he think that somebody from the executive offices, like the head of marketing for the company, was going to come across the street or go over to his office, go over to their hotel and say thank you to him, Joe the bellman? Well, that's what we started doing. And the fact that we ended our meetings on a positive note had 3 big positivity or thriving things that came out of it. Number 1 is we reminded ourselves that there's some good things happening. And frankly, when things are going badly, you really do need to remind yourself that there's some things that are going well as well. Secondly, Joe got the positivity, he got rewarded and recognized by a senior executive in the company. And for the next 24 hours, it was like, a stone in a pond. The ripple effect of how Joe felt about his life and around everybody around him, not just the employees he worked with and the customers, but when he went home that night, was a positive. And then thirdly, the fact that actually it was from someone from a different department, that was our rule. If you're going to go out and say the thank you, and you're going to sort of do the positivity, it couldn't be someone from operations to say thank you to Joe. Joe's in the operations department, the hotel operations. So we had someone from marketing or from IT go and say thanks to Joe. And that was important because it created some cross-fertilization in a difficult time. So for those of you who feel like, okay, this is a bunch of just nonsense, positive thinking kind of stuff, well, look at a boat. This is a sailboat. And if you look at what's above the water versus what's below the water, the average sailboat has about three times as much above the water, the mast, than what's below the water, the keel. the bottom of the boat, and then the keel, which is what sort of helps to steer the boat to some degree, and that and the rudder. So what was able to be, just from a physics perspective, the fact that if you have an organization where all you ever have is positivity and no one talks about the negativity, then you've got a sailboat with 10 times tall mast to 1 times tall keel, and that sailboat's going to actually flip over or capsize because it's a bunch of bullshit. Excuse me. But it's just people giving positivity to each other and not actually talking about the negative. You got to talk about the negative. That's the keel. But you could also have a boat or an organization where the mast is only 1/3 and the keel is 3 times bigger than the mast. And that most organizations are like that. And then the senior executives wonder why this damn sailboat won't go very fast. So there's a physical side to this. But let me just sum up by saying the following. I was a CEO for 24 years. When I went to Stanford Business School, I was the youngest guy in my class, and the second youngest guy in my class was Seth Godin. You probably heard of Seth Godin. So Seth and I are good friends, have known each other since business school. And Seth knew he wanted to be a writer when he grew up. And I said, I'd sort of like to be a writer someday, but at first I want to go out and be an entrepreneur, and maybe I'll be a CEO someday. And one thing I said to Seth years ago is he said, well, what do you got to do at business school? This is our second year of business school. We wrote a book together in our second year of business school, Seth and I did. And he says, well, what do you need to do? What skill set do you have to have? And I said, well, I sort of feel like I have to be a superhuman. In order to be a CEO someday, and a successful CEO, I've got to be a superhuman. And what I really believe now, 24 years after being a CEO, doing it for 24 years, and there are very few people who've been a CEO for the same company for 24 years, the company I founded, is it's not about being a superhuman. It's about being a superhuman. And just realizing that as the CEO of a company, this sounds like a cliche, but you're sort of like the chief emotions officer. And let me explain that, because some of you are like, oh, God, this is just agony. What I mean by that is that the fact is, this is a petri dish. This organization, Google, is a petri dish. Your department is a petri dish. We learned from Daniel Goleman 16 years ago when he wrote the book Emotional Intelligence that 2/3 of the success of business leaders tended to come from their emotional intelligence, their EQ, and about 1/3, on average, from their IQ and from their level of experience in their work. So it was the first sort of, there was work done before Daniel Goleman ever wrote about this, but this is where it got popularized. So 16 years later, we know this. Smart guy here, in a different state right there. Matt Lieberman's a neuroscientist at UCLA, and he's proven the following. When you're feeling anxious or angry or frustrated, when you make decisions from that place of anger or anxiety, and you try to make a decision in that moment, you're losing 10 to 15 IQ points in the act of making that decision. Now, if I'm giving a speech to a non-Google crowd, I would say the following. Some of us in the crowd can't afford to lose 10 to 15 IQ points. But at Google, you can afford to lose 10 to 15 IQ points because you're all smart. But the bottom line is this, is that when we are making decisions in that reactive place, think back to that Viktor Frankl quote about, the choice in our lives and the freedom is actually responding to things, not reacting. When we come from a place of response as opposed to reaction, we are able, and what Lieberman showed is if you just even name the emotion. And when I introduced the idea of these equations, he says, well, that's just taking it one step further, that's even better. You're taking yourself from the amygdala, that fight or flight part of your brain, the caveman part of your brain, the part of your brain that frankly is not so smart. It's good. It has its role in your life, for sure. And you're taking yourself to a different part of your brain where more reasoning happens. So it's a good thing. And finally, if you have never read the book Connected by Nicholas Christakis, I highly recommend you read it. It came out 2 or 3 years ago. What he was able to show is that our emotions are contagious. And we already knew this. If I go up and smile at Meng, he'll smile back. We have mirror neurons such that we sort of end up aping each other. But also we have socialization that means that whatever the organizational environment we're in has an influence on how we're feeling. Not a surprise. But the truth is that the fear is just as contagious as the flu. And if you're a leader of an organization and you don't understand that, and you're fostering fear in an organization that needs to be creative and innovative, duh, you're actually not doing a very smart thing about actually helping people to live up to their potential and use their brain potential in a way that's actually going to be using their emotions to their maximum potential. So just to sum up, some of us in the room saying, well, I'm not a leader. Well, you are a leader. You're a leader yourself. You're chief emotions officer of yourself. You may have children and a spouse. You may be the leader of your family. You may be the leader of a department of 3 people or 5 people. Leaders are the emotional thermostats. Where we set our emotions have an enormous influence on what the group feels about their experience in the group. 50 to 70, according to some surveys, 50 to 70% of how a group feels about their experience in a group comes back to how they feel about the leader and how they feel the leader feels about the group. So I know this. During the dot-com bust, I set my emotional thermostat high and our company did well. During this downturn, I had a really hard time. Ultimately, I sold a majority share of the company to John Pritzker, whose father started Hyatt, and he's a billionaire, and it was great. It allowed me to go spend more time writing, researching, etc. But I was not in a place where I was a very good emotional thermostat for the organization, and I could see it. So I've seen it on both sides, where I've been great at it and where I wasn't great at it. So the most neglected fact in business, in my opinion, is that we're all human. And I learned how to actually play with a computer and start working on a computer at Stanford and then at Stanford Business School. I learned how to drive a car in high school at driver's education. But I never learned emotions. I never had a class on emotions. And that's what my intent has been, is to help us understand the ingredients in this piece of baggage that we're carrying around with us for a lifetime. And if you can understand the ingredients of anxiety, or the ingredients of joy or happiness, or the ingredients of authenticity, then you're able to influence those ingredients a little bit more. So you may have your own emotional equation. If you do, go to, that's the book, Emotional Equations. She's got them right here. BookSync has them. And you may have your own emotional equation that you want to come up with, and you can go to our Facebook site and actually post your emotional equations there. And with that, thank you. I'm going to say thank you, and then I'm going to open up to see if there's any questions. But thank you very much for being here today. So, anybody have a question that's going to scare the hell out of me about the math side of this thing? Let me just say one thing about the math, and Dan was very helpful with this. In the book, I'm very clear that the math is not perfect. And frankly, if you take an equation like despair equals suffering minus meaning and you invert it in a different way, it doesn't work. Some of the equations do work. If you say, some of them they don't work. So I'm the first to say, don't try to actually get too precise about this. But what it does do is it helps you understand the relationship between these emotions. And that's the part where it is a bit of a mantra, and it can be a mind instrument for you. Yes?
So I'll start with a thank you. This
Thank
is really
you.
incredible. There were a lot of equations there, though. Is there any that you would say is sort of your number one that you pay attention most to?
Well, let me say this. So the one, it's sort of, it's like, over the course of 25 years, we've created like 55 boutique hotels. So people say, what's your favorite? Well, my favorite's like the Phoenix, the funky rock and roll motel in the Tenderloin. That's our lowest end hotel because it was the first. So the first one that means to me, the despair equals suffering minus meaning, is one that's very meaningful to me on a daily basis and has been very helpful for me when I'm talking with friends who are going through a difficult time. The anxiety one is, I think, been the most effective one in terms of in an organizational context of helping people to sort of say, I'm feeling this anxiety, what do I do with it? And the balance sheet, that anxiety balance sheet, is really valuable for people. The one that recently has been helpful with this book and sort of like saying, okay, Chip, you have a tendency to get too much into the pursuit of things, and why don't you enjoy what, the little ride you're on right now? Has helped me to make sure I'm not in the denominator of the happiness equation too often. I mean, those are some of the ones I've actually presented to you. There's a bunch of other ones. There's 18 that are presented in the book in 17 different chapters. And what I had to do, because this could be just a silly little parlor game, if I didn't go out and make sure that if I'm doing an equation on envy and jealousy, which is one chapter, that I spent time with experts in the field to say, okay, tell me about the nature of what are the ingredients of envy and jealousy. So that's what I needed to do, and that's what I did. So thank you. Yes.
Thank you. This might be helpful for other Jewish people in the room, but I was wondering if you've done any thinking about where guilt comes from.
Where what comes from?
Where guilt comes from.
It's interesting. Guilt is one that I want to do in the next. So there's probably, it looks, because the book's doing well, there may be like a second version. That's one of that and trust are like number one and number two. But I can't tell you, I have not done my research yet in terms of guilt. Guilt's a fascinating emotion, and so I promise you that it's going to be in the next book, because it's one that I think is quite pervasive too. Do you have any suggestions of what you think? What's your equation for guilt? It has something to do with your mother.
I think it has something to do with how much responsibility you take for something.
Yeah, one of the equations in the book is regret. And regret equals disappointment plus a sense of responsibility. And so actually, I'm fascinated by regret and remorse and guilt and shame. Guilt and shame are interesting. The difference between guilt and shame is guilt is I did something wrong, and shame is I am wrong. And so all of that's fascinating to me, and so I just haven't done my research on it yet.
Great,
so.
thanks. And also, I was wondering quickly if it seems like Burning Man has been a big influence on you.
Yeah.
I've never been. I'm hoping to go this year, and I was wondering if you could briefly kind of share what about Burning Man is so great or healthy.
Yeah. Well, let me say it's everybody is going to have a different experience. So. And I'm on the board, so I'm on the board of Burning Man. Burning Man has a nonprofit board, and I'm on the board of Burning Man. So if you want to read a funny
also,
article,
how do we get tickets if we don't?
How do you get tickets? Yeah, that's the hard thing. Is there's now a stupid ass lottery that doesn't make a lot of sense. That we're still figuring out. So there's going to be some new announcements on that soon. I think the thing I like about Burning Man, what Burning Man gets a lot of attention for is the drugs, the music, the nudity. But at the core of what I think Burning Man really speaks to is the creative and artistic spirit and how that unites us. And there's a spirituality and a utopian sort of belief in the world, which I think is really, takes us back to childhood. It takes us back, for me, takes me to that sense of like wonder about, what the world could be like if these Burning Man principles were, lived every day. So I love it for that. I hate the dust storms. I hate, there's all kinds of other things that you don't like about it. But more than anything, the creative spirit is what really drives me to go almost every year.
Great. Thanks.
So thank you. Yes. Question.
Hi there.
Hi.
Thanks so much for the talk. That was
Yeah.
great. And it's so meaningful for how we show up as people and as leaders. I was wondering, though, how you think this impacts customers and users.
Yeah. Well, one of my equations I had ever before I wrote this book, or even the research, was I talked about it in my company, is disappointment equals expectations minus reality. And it's sort of one of the more basic equations in the book. Disappointment equals expectations minus reality. Think of it. You are going on your honeymoon. Expectations here, reality here, disappointment or divorce there. So there's times when I think the equations can be very helpful. And that one's helpful for me when I'm talking to our marketing department. The marketing department wants to do everything they can to paint a beautiful picture of what the hotel's going to be like, and the web's going to tell us. But if we don't do a very good job, an accurate job of telling the story, we are going to create disappointed customers over and over again. So how do we improve the reality or make sure that the expectations are in line with what really is? So that's one of a handful of equations that I think are relevant to the customer experience. There's a few other ones too. I'm actually speaking at South by Southwest in March, and my whole talk is on emotional equations for the customer experience. So I'm in the process of actually writing that speech. So I'll figure that out, and maybe it'll be online.
Yeah, please let us know.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, Chip. Thanks
Yeah.
so much for coming. Also, I just stayed at my first Joie de Vivre hotel, Hotel Irwin in Venice Beach.
Oh,
this week. It was
yeah.
awesome.
I love the Irwin. It's funky.
Yeah, really cool.
Yeah.
So I was wondering what opportunities employees at Joie de Vivre have to learn about these concepts, and if so, how you teach them.
Well, we have Joie de Vivre University, and I actually teach a class on emotional equations and started doing that about 2.5, 3 years ago. Senior leaders in the company have done half-day and full-day retreats with me on our emotions. So in essence, what we've gotten to a place is we realized, damn, we didn't have any courses. We had courses, half our courses in Joie de Vivre University are skill-based and half of them are sort of lifestyle-oriented, yoga, meditation, search inside yourself kind of things. But we didn't have any, we had 0 classes on emotions other than understanding personality types, which was a course on the I always pronounce it wrong, the Enneagram. We had a course on that. But we didn't have anything about emotions. And so we started teaching emotions classes, and they were the most popular classes. So now we're teaching more emotions classes, and that's part of how we are trying to help improve the emotional fluency. See, my belief is that emotional intelligence is what Dan Goleman talked about, and I love it, but you can be intelligent about something, but not fluent. I could be intelligent about going to France and knowing the dialects of French and the history and the origins of the language, but I can't walk down the street and go into the shop and actually speak it. Or I can be great at actually critiquing someone's film or their dance moves, but I can't dance. Being fluent means you can do it. And so to me, emotional intelligence is great, and emotional fluency is a step beyond it, where you start becoming more intuitive about how the emotions affect you. And that's why, for me, the equations are a step towards fluency as opposed to just the intelligence. So, yeah, thanks. Because how do you use them? One more. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. If we take equations at the face value, it looks like that it's important to minimize disappointment, for example.
Minimize what?
Disappointment, the suffering, meaning, and minimize disappointment, right? So my question is, what your thoughts are about emotions and time? Because maybe there is a time for disappointment, and then just let it be, and then not try to minimize it at the moment.
Well, it's a very good question, especially in the context of regret. And actually at one point Dan and I were trying to figure out one equation, I can't remember which one it was, that had a time factor to it, and it was a little challenging. But there's some emotions where the emotion can get stronger over time. Regret is one of them. It depends on what you regret, but generally speaking, what has been shown is what we tend to do, we have something called loss aversion, and we don't want to actually, if you ask someone whether you choose to, you have 2 choices. No electric shocks on this one. You can either choose to earn $200. We're going to flip a coin. If you guess the right side of the coin, you get $200. If you get it wrong, you get 0. You can either actually flip the coin and get 0 or 200, or I can give you $100 right now. Most people will choose the $100. Why? I mean, the math of it suggests that they wouldn't. Why? It's because they don't want the regret. So that's one example. Now, if all of a sudden you say, okay, there's a component where you can actually add regret to it, all of a sudden it goes back to the math. What they found over time is that people have a tendency in the course of time to regret what they didn't do in life as opposed to what they did do and where they made a mistake. So what's interesting about time is you have to actually sort of factor it in for certain emotions and know that with some emotions, with most emotions, with time, the emotion dissipates. And from a biological perspective, the biology of an emotion in terms of physically what's happening sensation-wise in your body, it lasts about 90 seconds. So, but how we bathe in that emotion for a lot longer than 90 seconds is what's interesting. And some emotions like regret actually can get worse with time. So long story short is that's a piece where it's sort of like the advanced class of emotional equations is how do you factor time in. I didn't do it for the sake of this book because it got a little too complicated. And some emotions were not relevant. Happiness definitely trails off over time around a particular issue. So that's a long-winded answer, but it's a good question because the truth is, in the moment, we tend to actually feel, it's like anything in life. When we're feeling that immense joy or happiness, there's this tendency to feel at that moment it's going to last forever. And when you're feeling the intensity of the despair in that moment, we think it's going to last forever. And the truth is that our emotions are like the weather. We're good external weather forecasters. You knew it was going to probably rain today because a forecaster told you or you could sense it. We're not so good at our own internal weather forecasting. And we have a tendency to think that if there's a snowstorm today, there's going to be a snowstorm the rest of our lives when we're feeling despair. And the fact is, weather comes and goes, And the best thing you can do with these emotions is to help them move through you. And that's what the word emotion means. It means to move. So, Dan.
And with that, let's say thank you to Chip. Thanks, Chip.
Thank you.